Hi, this is Ron Jeffries. You're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I am this evening's Master of Ceremonies, Jay Hersko, and tonight we will be talking about acceptance criteria. This was actually a user-submitted request from, I'm sorry if I'm going to mispronounce it, especially with my last name, username Dwarka, who asked some questions around acceptance criteria. So with me, I have James Gifford, I have Colleen Johnson, and I have Andrew Leff, and we are going to dive a little bit deeper into the idea of acceptance criteria. So first things first, we're going to start off with the history and where does this concept come from? Now, James, I know you and I had a conversation about this. So what were your thoughts on the genesis of this idea? Because if I recall, it's not exactly in the Scrum Guide, is it?
No, it's not. Acceptance criteria is not in the Scrum Guide. And all the research that I've done, I couldn't find a definitive answer on when acceptance criteria became part of the user story. But if you look back to XP and the original work done by all those crazy cats, part of a user story was acceptance tests. So, what acceptance tests were automated tests to validate that you were done with a story. Not unit level testing. This was an actual separate set of automated tests to prove out the validity of the story. So Mike Cohn picked those up, and they were in his 2004 book. It's user stories and something. It's published under the Addison Wesley label. So it keeps going on, and then around 2006. Is when I really start seeing the word acceptance criteria turning up. So my guess is that folks that were non-technical in nature, and since we've lost by now XP's kind of dropped off the map. I'm pretty sure that the people started adding these on as business people and people thinking through the requirements of it being actual acceptance criteria now, and they lost the emphasis on the automated piece of it.
So your theory is that it actually dovetailed out of XP methodology, and it went from a more technical type of test-driven design almost sort of thing to more of taking on a life of its own.
Yeah, and that's what I believe. And I couldn't find where we actually start diverging. But up until 2004, 2005, it was still pretty much referenced in all the materials I could find as acceptance tests as opposed to acceptance criteria.
And Andrew, you had a theory that you swore you saw something in the BA body of knowledge. Is that correct? Could have sworn?
Yeah, I thought so. And unfortunately, I don't have a copy to reference. So I'm going to have to follow up on that to validate it. But I think back to the XP, going through some of the, the core values or the principles of XP, I think, it really does. We're not really straying that far away from the values of XP around, simplicity, communication, feedback, respect, and courage. I mean, it still all falls in line with Scrum, although Scrum doesn't necessarily call out acceptance criteria as part of, a necessity in a story per se. I think it's evolved into that. And as anyone that's Scrum Master, product owner, coach, whatever, a good story, acceptance criteria is part of that basis of what makes up a good user story.
Okay. So now let's start digging into the details. So I'm going to start with you, Colleen. What's your experience been with teams using them?
I think, I guess I feel like I've seen teams kind of run both ends of the spectrum with acceptance criteria where they've been a mile long or 2 bullet points. And I think, I guess one of the trends I feel like I've seen more recently, and I attribute a lot of it to lean startup practices and maybe a combination of the maturity of the team. But I feel like I've seen a lot more dev teams taking ownership for writing the acceptance criteria so that it's not so handed to them, but a little more collaborative. And I think the reason I mentioned Lean Startup as a potential contributor to that trend is that I think I've seen a lot of organizations shifting their product team to being more customer, a lot tighter to the customer than maybe they were in the past, which seems like a great thing.
Great. James?
Dealing with agile teams, a lot of the times in most of the engagements I've been on, it's been a really heavy BA supported task. Product owners doing the handoff to business analysts to go chase the rest of that acceptance criteria. It's not something that I ultimately always promote. But if you have a product owner that's disengaged or, totally doing it from the side of their desk instead of a dedicated role, I definitely see some merit in it. One thing that I like to promote with newer teams is, in the old days, all user stories used to fit on the back or on an index card, and on the front you'd have the narrative, and then on the back you would see that acceptance criteria. So you can only fit about 3 to 5 bullets on the back of an index card. So, trying to keep user acceptance criteria to as much as needed, and potentially splitting. If we start getting into way too many acceptance criteria, is really looking at where we could split those to still deliver value to the customer.
And how about you, Andrew? What's your experience been as of late?
So I've been running into this a lot lately around looking at it from a different angle of we have a large set of predetermined business requirements, and a lot of those requirements don't necessarily translate well into stories. So taking those requirements and being able to group them and utilizing those requirements as acceptance criteria and creating stories based upon that has been an interesting exercise for me, and really trying to keep it that acceptance criteria simple, clear, simple language that, trying to alleviate any ambiguity regarding expected outcome. So literally, to me, this sets up sort of the QA or the testing tasks in a better way. So acceptance criteria to me is important when sort of going through that requirements breakdown exercise and really setting the team up to be able to execute on stories in a much more clear and concise, predictable way.
So it actually sounds like, Andrew, you're doing what amounts to test-driven development when it comes to requirements, right?
We're trying to move to that, yes. Not always necessarily successfully, but that's the direction that we're currently leading since we're sort of in a scaling effort, a group of teams to move towards. To get some of the dependencies flushed out, as well as to decouple some of the requirements that span across multiple teams.
A question I kind of have for the group too around your opening question, Jay, of how much or how little, how much did you see around acceptance criteria? I've often wondered if some of the difference in the quantity of the acceptance criteria is sometimes attributed to the availability of the product owner to the team. So sometimes that, a ton of detail, and Andrew, maybe you can expand on that too. And if there's a ton of detail, it's more of a drop from the BA or from the product owner to the team. Whereas maybe less, the ability to document less acceptance criteria requires more hands-on time with the product owner, with the team. What do you guys think of that approach?
I think with the product owner, I think it depends. I'll give you the agile answer. It depends. I feel like I just need to say that every podcast.
Somewhere Mike McCallum his ear just itched.
I think that it depends on the product owner and how much domain expertise they have. I've seen some product owners that are really detail oriented and in the weeds, and are focusing more on the development effort and not on the business value, and kind of creating that view of what business delivery should be, as opposed to, hey, this code needs to be, technically sound and blah, 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 blah. So I think collectively, the team has to move towards writing good acceptance criteria. I'm not sure it's just a single threaded product owner or business analyst. I think it's a collective effort.
I'll be honest with you, Colleen, I didn't think of the product owner, the stronger or available product owner angle. One of the things that I run up against a lot is sometimes acceptance criteria become a life of their own and they become huge and voluminous. And now that you brought up the product owner point, I think when I think of some of the situations where I've seen the acceptance criteria grow to, let's be quite honest here, what actually ends up resembling almost a full requirements document from the old way of doing things. I think that is because you have business analysts or systems analysts acting as an ersatz, product owner by proxy. And if they're tasked with just designing the acceptance criteria for a story, which is why I sort of want to go back to Left's later, the TDD version of acceptance criteria, and unpack that. But I think sometimes if you don't have a fairly mature team or a team that's starting out and they're going to write the acceptance criteria, by default, they're going to go back to this almost requirements sort of very heavy. James talked about a couple bullets on the back of a note card. I've seen acceptance criteria. They can almost look like a full requirement stock, like old school Alistair Coburn use case scenarios with the happy and unhappy path. So that's a good point. I didn't think about the role of a PO in building acceptance criteria. And I think if you remove the PO, left to their own devices, people revert to what they're used to. What are your thoughts, Gifford?
I mean, ultimately, it comes down to good story writing practices and the engagement of your product owner. If you have an engaged product owner and your team, from the analysts all the way down to the dev teams and the product owner, have been trained to write good user stories, acceptance criteria is a very manageable thing, even with positive and negative acceptance criteria, which we shouldn't forget about. It is important. So a lot of it is basic fundamentals, and I see young product owners, or product owners in mature or organizations where they haven't actually been empowered to actually do their job. You tend to see, or even been provided the right training, you do see these very verbose stories that are highly complicated and, large. Also, some of it you want to tie in there is losing sight of having a definition of done for when a story is actually done. You got to think of acceptance criteria as the definition of done for a user story. Or something I was reading earlier today that really kind of hit home. Instead of acceptance criteria, I kind of started kind of talking about conditions of satisfaction. Trying to bring that back to the actual customer that we're thinking about. Yeah. What are going to be the conditions of satisfaction for this user story, as opposed to thinking of it as just acceptance criteria?
And that's a good point, James, around sort of the premise of a clear pass-fail result. So literally writing your acceptance criteria to be clear and concise around truly what is pass-fail, and not having these sort of open-ended could be scenarios. So, getting that sort of to tie into the definition of done, so you truly can, accept the story as whatever the product owner or proxy to show that this has truly been completed, to have it tie into that definition of done. I think it's a challenge for most teams moving, to that maturity model.
So what has you guys' experience been? We talked about our experiences with using acceptance criteria. How engaged has QA been when it comes to writing your acceptance criteria? And do they add a unique wrinkle or a unique point of view that maybe the standard acceptance criteria authorship wouldn't cover? Colleen, I'll start with you.
I've seen QA be very involved in defining acceptance criteria. I think one of the angles I feel like they often bring that's unexpected or not as common is the what does this not include? Because I think they're thinking about, like Andrew's saying, they're thinking about all the tests they need to run. So a big part of that is, what do I not need to cover, or what shouldn't be there? So I think they typically bring some questions to the table and fleshing out the acceptance criteria that we're thinking, I think, more along the lines of, how do we please the customer, or what's the technical requirements. So I like that element of what shouldn't be there.
Andrew, observations?
I think for me, one of the challenges that I've been struggling with is with multiple teams is, how do you account for, when you're writing your acceptance criteria, the end-to-end process? So are you doing full like UAT testing as well? And I know a lot of times I'm challenged by the QA testers that want to test a fully end-to-end function, but yet they want to pull that into acceptance criteria or their testing scenarios when it's not really necessarily relevant to tie it into what the dev team or the Scrum team's definition of done is. So they want to execute based upon a full piece of end-to-end functionality, as opposed to just a snippet of code that would pass, maybe 5 of those acceptance criteria without having to test fully integrated, end-to-end functionality. That's something I think that just comes with experience and understanding your environment, as well as, having broader conversations and getting a different view or an understanding of how to test and what truly is what you can accept and what can happen, might be tied into your release definition of done. So is there acceptance criteria in your release definition of done, as opposed to just your iteration Scrum team definition of done?
That's a good point, end to end, and how it relates to acceptance criteria, because one of the things I see fairly frequently is, you're right, we do have the QA analyst, the QA aspect, where they want to tie a full soup to nuts solution inside an acceptance criteria, inside a story even. And that it's just it's misplaced when you have multiple systems doing multiple hops and you're trying to do acceptance for one story, but it covers 4 different applications. It's just a crazy application, and it probably comes from unclear explanation of expectation. James, thoughts?
So our QA friends definitely, can contribute a great deal to our acceptance tests and our acceptance criteria. And it depends on what your organization's doing from a QA standpoint. I know in one of the organizations we're working in now, they're really heavy into moving away from manual testers. So you see a lot more acceptance criteria becoming behavior-driven development, or BDD, which we're going to talk about probably later. But, when we see a lot of these acceptance criteria and we talk about end-to-end testing, what usually is happening here is the organization hasn't actually invested in any of those acceptance tests and creating that test suite to actually bring together that automation. So in organizations where we've seen more automation, we're seeing less and less desire for the end-to-end testing coming in to the actual user stories. So, it's really, where is your organization at with its practices? Where are they putting the value? Because, manual testing and acceptance of stories in a full regression is going to get unwieldy after some time. And you see a lot of that today. And Andrew and I went round and round and round at the previous client we were at on these scenarios, and trimming down acceptance criteria and turning that into part of the actual team's definition of done instead of story definition of done or acceptance criteria.
Good point. Colin, you want to take this full circle?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the other things I think comes up sometimes with the volume of acceptance criteria is, we talked about testers. That's where we kind of started this question. But I think without really having a good definition for what's not included in a story, or kind of drawing a concrete box around what's included in a user story, developers can also go down the rabbit hole and be like, well, while I'm here, I'm going to add this, and this, and then not realize that there's, potentially 3 more stories in the backlog that address all those things they started touching with, story A. And I feel like sometimes that's the nuance between really great acceptance criteria is saying, story A is this one concrete thing, and then all these other parts that are connected you'll find in story B, C, and D. So, when we think about how to slice the story as well, part of that is making sure that the acceptance criteria is contained and independent from all these other ones, so that you don't start bleeding into, working on story A, but you're touching story B and C at the same time.
So it's a really good point. So how do you control that? How do you control the Raiders of the Lost Ark acceptance criteria boulder chasing you down the path? What are some of the tactics you guys use to try and hem that in? I mean, I know Left talked a lot about definition of done, and James talked about conditions of satisfaction. But however, let's be honest here. Sometimes we may be working with teams with varying levels of experience or training or familiarity. So what are some of the ways you guys try to keep those acceptance criteria constrained so they don't turn into a full-blown requirements document? James. Damn it.
So trying to keep the acceptance criteria from overrunning and becoming the requirements document. A lot of it's just good old fashioned story writing workshops, continuously working on teams. I probably run, at least a story writing workshop once a week for many BAs, BSAs, product owners. Like it's continuous training and keeping the pressure on the rudder. As a coach, I pop in and out of people's backlogs just to find stories, and I pick up use cases, and I'll sit down with them and go, we could have written this story 14 different ways. And broken this acceptance criteria down. Here's where we could split it and still add value. Getting back to talking about invest, making and good story writing hygiene, and that's where a lot of this acceptance criteria comes into, because you can still implement things and deliver value, and not capture every bit of acceptance criteria in there. So if we took an example of like a login for a website, as a user, I want to log in so I can see my account information. So in that acceptance criteria, you might see in there, 3 failed logins, lock the account. You may see in there, I want to reset a password link and, maybe like some hello welcome message. So when I started looking at that, that would be like that scenario of the 3 bullet points. I've seen a lot of developers or in QA folks that, they would just keep packing on there about like, well, what if the user enters their incorrect name and then the incorrect password and then right name, incorrect password, like all of these conditions. And the real intent of the story is to give these people a login and to add some security to it. So, we're not susceptible to brute force type methods of password cracking. So if I had to do that, maybe in that first iteration that we released, we split the story off at just doing the fail, the 3 attempt fail piece of the story. And instead of having that whole flow of reset my password, when they click the link the first time, all it does is gives them an 800 number and says, please contact our customer care center to reset your password. Not the most ideal experience, but it does shrink down the acceptance criteria from all the different hedge cases and things that the team could have piled onto that.
You just mentioned hedge cases. Sorry, Colleen, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
You mentioned hedge cases, and that's a big, I think that ties to your remark about story writing hygiene and workshops. Is a lot of times, I think by default, especially those of us that have been BAs, we want to include those fringe cases, those 80-20, those wacko, that 20%, that's the outlier type stuff. And I think that's an important thing to call out too, is you need to be cognizant of not trying to design it for everything. You want to design for the 80% that you want to cover off, and the fringe stuff you're going to tackle later. Colleen, what were you going to say? I sort of cut you off there.
Oh no, keep going. The schedule.
But that's, I think, especially from those, again, I used to write requirements, and it's hard to not get bogged down in those, the fringe cases. I know that the user's going to try and do these things out of sequence. It's going to break something. So you're right. It's against your nature to not include those sort of things, because you want to make sure you've got a holistic picture. And that's where you end up with a 7-page user story. And you might as well just write an FRD and go back to waterfall. Did I say that? I just said that.
Well, and giving yourself that space, right? Like in the example Gift just shared, maybe see how many people forget their password before you add 1,800 ways to get your password back, and put some metrics around some of your stories so that you're giving yourself a chance to get things out quicker because they're small and independent and easily testable and easily deployable. Get them out, and then see how the usage metrics look before you add all those edge cases or kind of fringe scenarios in. And that, I think, gives you a lot more flexibility in how you cut up your epic or cut up your user stories, because you're giving yourself a chance to get things out and learn from them and then adapt to what you deliver next.
So it's a good point, and it's interesting you mentioned cut up. So I'm going to switch gears over to you, Andrew. Splitting stories. So splitting stories, especially when acceptance criteria involved. What are some of the signs that you see or have noticed that let you know that, hey, maybe the story's a little bit too big and I got to split it? Are there any indicators when it comes to a team writing acceptance criteria? Is it when it's 3 pages or when it's too many bullets that you realize, hey, maybe we got to split this into separate stories?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I don't know. I struggle with the splitting story piece because I haven't figured out a good way to split stories or, around that process. It's usually, sort of an issue when teams can't complete a story, then split it and take credit for some of the work and move it to the next. For me, with acceptance criteria, I'd like to coach the team to really utilize acceptance criteria as sort of the boundaries for a user story. So, confirm when a user story is completed and working as intended. To me, that's the definition of how you would implement acceptance criteria. So if you have too much acceptance criteria, then I start to look at that story and say, this might be too big. Is this an epic? Is this a feature? Or is this just way too big of a story that we need to break down? So to me, it invokes more conversation and working with the team to understand why we need all of this, and are we trying to do too much within this story?
Gifford, what are your thoughts? Along the same lines?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much have the same stance. Splitting user stories, and I hate talking about Dean. Good old Dean Leffingwell. But that was one of the main chapters in his in his first book that he put out in was it 2010 or 2011. Splitting at the acceptance criteria was one of his options, and there's been a lot of other work written around that. And to Colleen's point, putting it out there and finding out how many people are actually hitting your edge case before you spend time to prioritize additional stories. I do advocate for negative acceptance criteria, and I do think it's important, but doing it smartly and not wasting a lot of time for things that potentially are not as value add. It makes more sense. We've broken out some of those negative cases into additional stories to do at a later date and time, to be prioritized once we actually did have some validated learning coming out of the system.
So what are your thoughts, Colleen? Any good tips, or is it really just a Mike McCalla, it depends when it comes to doing the whole acceptance criteria splitting and signs that you're in trouble and this is bigger than a bread box? And she's on mute.
I said there's only one It Depends for podcasts, and in like the first 3 minutes, which isn't really. I would say, I agree a lot with what Gifford just said. I think going back to how you mentioned invest criteria for story writing, I always introduce invest criteria and then tell everyone my favorite three, which is that it's independent, small, and testable. But to me, testable and independent is the most important, and then small. So I think sometimes we work ourselves into a hole where we focus so much on making stories small that they can't be delivered independently, and then we kind of lose the value of the small story. So to me, that's the nuance in breaking things apart, is that if I can't deliver A without B, that I really break the stories apart in a smart way, because now my hands are tied and they're so tightly coupled. They're still just kind of one big story.
That's a great point, and that's another podcast in of itself, right? The whole getting too granular to the point where I have 400 stories and I have to deliver 237 of them to actually get a working feature. That's something that I've seen with a lot of teams, where in the rush to chunk the work, we chunk it too far. We actually overcompensate.
And I just had a client who flat out told me our user stories are tasks. Like, our stories are an epic, or should be an epic, or the other way around. And our stories are basically tasks so that we can distribute them across the team. But then it took 8 stories to get one thing out the door. So I think you can totally fall prey to, did you say chunking too small?
Chunking. Yeah. It's an oxymoron, right? Like military intelligence, Jumbo Shrimp, efficient project manager. We're not going to go there. Mr. Leff, anything to add?
So I think, a lot of times we talk about making user stories smaller, but it might go back to the definition around business value. What are we trying to deliver? So do we truly understand what we're trying to deliver from a business value standpoint, and creating those stories based upon business value, as opposed to just small segments of code that we've been asked to implement because that's what we were told to do. So understanding what the goals are and what the organization is trying to deliver to the customer, whoever that might be, and having a better understanding of what business value is being delivered, as opposed to just delivering pieces of code.
So my next question is the one that's going to be, this is actually the crux of this whole conversation for me, is the whole conversation around acceptance criteria vis-a-vis NFRs, right? So your non-functional requirements and your ILITs, your scalability, availability, resiliency, security, all those sort of things. How do you guys handle those in your respective teams? How do you manage them? Because this ties into sort of the question before about user acceptance criteria becoming overwhelming. I can see where real quickly this gets out of control. So I'm curious to see how you deal with it in your teams without letting things get out of hand. Mr. Gifford, we're going to start with you.
All right. So, we get into non-functional requirements like, it must work in Opera, Firefox, IE 11, Edge, Chrome. You start getting into, we have 9 browsers that we need to test. So, with those NFRs, go right in the definition of done with the team. That's where I like to put them. And if I'm working with multiple teams, I like to split those NFRs up across a multitude of teams. So now, you give every team 2 browsers to worry about. And if you're using good patterns around UI development and theming and creating good style sheets, everything that all those teams are doing, they'll all, as they work through their areas of the product, all those different browser scenarios will come up and cascade down through all the styles and themes. So that's a quick, easy way to kind of battle the browsers. The scalabilities and things like that. We've done different stories out there for scalability testing, performance testing. I know that it's not always ideal, but at the same time, I would rather get it out there and then focus on making it fast. Let's get it out there working. Let me get the feedback and then worry about making it fast. Because if your customers aren't complaining about the message call and how long it takes, why do I need to take it down from a second if nobody's complaining about it? So why am I going to waste a developer's time, to optimize something that nobody is complaining about?
So before I finish going around the horn, I want to call that out. So that's the example I was actually thinking of. So wouldn't typically a developer standard practices like the Java practice inside of enterprise, wouldn't their list of standard practices have those things like how long for a timeout, how long to expect for a call, how do you handle a timeout, those sort of things? Wouldn't that be probably something that's part of your standards as far as development spec, and you wouldn't have to necessarily call that out? Or is it something that does need to be called out?
We've had product owners ultimately call out a lot of that performance stuff and set call times and response times, and a lot of them, we've seen them go out to competitor sites and take actions on their site and time them, and then start formulating, our performance needs to be on par or better than these guys' sites. It should be in developer, it should be understood at the beginning of these, and like it goes back to those second stories around some of those items. We've used that technique.
Colleen, what have been your experiences with the NFRs and the ILITs and all that fun stuff?
So as you guys know, I work a lot with Kanban, and I think that maybe drives a little bit more of the decoupling of stories than Scrum sprints might, or when you're working with a bundled deployment. And I think that typically requires that a lot of those ILITs get baked into the stories. So that has been one of the differences I've seen in the two, between the two different methodologies, is that, and that can be true of any continuous deployment environment, right? If every story is going to production independently, those ILITs have to be baked in. Those NFRs have to be baked into each story. So in some cases, I think your stories get a little bigger if they're going to production by themselves. I think if you're doing any kind of batch deployment, I've typically seen teams pull those NFR type stories out and kind of bake them into that end-to-end or integration test cycle or period at the end of a sprint or at the end of a release train, because it's cheaper to do it all at once than to do it on each one if you're bundling everything for one release.
Mr. Leff?
Yeah, sort of along the same lines as what Colleen is saying. My experience has been more around having those NFRs. The team can capture some of those within stories, but a lot of that work is flushed out, when we have a release definition of done. So, those tests are sort of run around when we're ready to release, because we don't necessarily release into, my experience recently is not everything gets released into production. There's deployments that need to happen, and a lot of the organizations can't quite release right away into production. So due to whatever, sort of cultural habits that they have. So a lot of that stuff is flushed out around sort of what we need to test to make sure that we're compliant with what the organization needs to be and what the customer's expectation is into a release. So we might only release every quarter, or our release cycle might be only every couple months. So that might be a bunch of sprints that, we're coupling together, and then we're basically doing that testing during that time before we release into production.
Let me ask you this just as an aside, when you have, say, 5 sprints, all piled into going into a release, right? Do they rewrite testing specific stories that cover these type of things? Or is it just something that through tribal knowledge, we know we need to look at A, B, and C?
We'll capture it, because, making that assumption that everyone is on the same page is not always a good thing. So we'll capture that in stories, and sometimes we'll even, this is like, probably will get some flack for this, but it might be handed off to a UAT cycle where they're creating their own sort of sprint, their release cycle around testing, and we'll capture that in stories where they need to test for these things, and their business scenarios are testing that sort of either performance or whatever some of those NFRs might be flushed out during their full suite of UAT testing.
Hey man, whatever works. I know somewhere some dogmatist is yelling and screaming at his phone right now, but whatever, as long as it gets done. Another topic I want to touch on, which I will give a little bit of a mea culpa here in this fact that I don't see a lot of this in my current gig, but negative acceptance criteria. And Gifford, you mentioned this 3 or 4 times, so I'm going to start with you again. You're the sacrificial lamb. Go into a little bit of detail, if you wouldn't mind, about negative acceptance criteria, examples you've seen, how you use it, things of that nature.
Yeah, so I would be remiss if this wasn't a nudging from Mr. Ryan Lockhart. So to make sure that this made this podcast, and it is the gatekeeper. These negative cases are important. We witnessed firsthand some of the negative cases weren't actually caught in a scenario where we actually had a production release go out and we took down production for 3 days because we missed some of these negative acceptance criterias. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen all the time, but it is important to not take the happy path. We all like to think that all of our users are intelligent people. But the sad thing is that with a lot of corporations and the way they train folks and they're building internal software, they will do the darndest things in those tools. So you do need some negative criteria where you may have some various combinations of data that shouldn't be allowed, and be taken into consideration around error handling, error messaging. Some of those negative cases tie into user experience in general. You don't want that really weird. You want that really weird experience where you get the error message that's like error 999.
Well, it's always exciting.
Like, what is that? Well, somebody missed a negative case on that scenario, and now we're having a bad experience.
So thank you, James. I think that's all I want to cover off on negative acceptance criteria. So and I'm going to stick with you for the next question. You mentioned before, only because you introduced it, Your Honor, behavior-driven development and using a BDD tool to generate acceptance criteria. Can you go give us a little bit of background on that? Because I've never come across that, but I'm pretty interested in the idea.
Okay, so for everybody, I mentioned it earlier on the podcast, but BDD is behavior-driven development. Dan North introduced it. It kind of started coming out when we started seeing the tools like Cucumber and Selenium. So those are automation tools that are used for automating testing in the middle tier layers of the testing pyramid. And the top tier of the testing pyramid, if you go back and look at, you can find that Mike Cohn article out there if you're more interested about the testing pyramid. But what it focuses on is putting acceptance criteria in a given then when format. So given the user is on the login page, when the user enters login credentials and correct login user credentials, then the system should take them to their account. Something to that effect. And there are tools out there. There's one that's called BDD Editor, and I'll put the link in the show notes for that tool. But what BDD Editor does is it allows you to take your user story and actually create what is called a feature file. And that feature file is basically used to put into Cucumber, which then if you were using Java, a Java-based platform, it would interact with the JUnit and actually run automated tests that doesn't require a developer to write. So you could have a business analyst sitting around plugging away at these acceptance criteria of given when then, and actually building that criteria for you. We've had some really engaged product owners that wanted to write their acceptance criteria like that because they wanted more automation, and the development team wasn't able to keep up with that as part of their day to day. So we could get into a whole thing on automated testing on
Yeah, I
on
really
another
don't.
podcast. But
We could spend a whole episode talking about your cucumber. So one of the last things I want to talk about, Lef, and you introduced it, so it's a late addition to the agenda. It's your approach of doing what amounts to test-driven design, starting with the acceptance criteria and working way backwards to a story. Now, for a new type of team, I think that would actually be pretty beneficial. It isn't a bad idea. So if you wouldn't mind, can you walk us through like an example, even something like something as simple as creating a website or a login page or something like that? How would you go about using your bottoms-up approach, starting with the acceptance criteria and ending up with a story, if you wouldn't mind?
Killing me. So it's not, to me, it was out of necessity, since this book of work was already predefined, predetermined, and pre-written from a requirements perspective. So trying to figure out how to coach the teams around how to break that into stories, we had to start somewhere. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So utilizing those requirements and taking a look at those. So we sort of went back to almost the sort of rough days around how do we break that down. So if we're trying to think of a good example, so literally if you're like building a car or even a house, you have to start somewhere. So we know we want to build a house, but you're not gonna put windows into that house until you have that frame built. So understanding what needs to be started and how we want to start building that house per se, without getting into the details. So if we have the details already, we want to take that and sort of group that into sort of themes or categories. And then from there, utilize those requirements as that acceptance criteria and break those and sort of roll them up into what we're trying to deliver from a business value perspective. So it's a challenging exercise. I know that the teams I'm coaching right now are struggling in that area because they're so focused on what needs to get delivered, whether it be a button or, enabling a state to be able to provide a new function for healthcare management, whatever it may be, without being so far into the weeds and really rolling that up. Can you hear my tap shoes tapping in the background? I'm going to tap dance around this a little bit, but it's really trying to get that conversation going and sort of take those requirements and back into a story. So I haven't figured out a great way to do it other than, unfortunately just sitting and going through each and every requirement and working with the team to realize that it's not a one for one. We're really looking at this in a much broader scale.
I mean, thanks, man. I mean, I know I definitely put you on the spot because we weren't planning on talking about that, but I think that's a unique and interesting approach, and I might actually try and use some of this because I think that would help not only drive some better user story quality, but it's better user story, better acceptance criteria, and actually we talked about splitting and how to know when to split. I think that will help drive logical structure itself, which I think is a good thing. So that about covers our agenda for this evening. I know this wasn't a very sexy topic for a lot of you listeners, not one of the exciting things. I'm sure you'd rather hear us yell at each other about what we think about some of the frameworks we all work with. But it is a topic, especially that we saw on the message board, and I think that it's one of these fringe sort of facets of Agile and iterative development I think are fairly important. So I wanted to thank all my hosts for this evening. Anybody have anything they want to plug? Colleen, upcoming events, speaking engagements, slut shaming?
I'm not plugging that. I'll be in DC for the Agile DC meetup on February 7th, so next Tuesday. And then in Atlanta for the Atlanta DC or the Atlanta area meetup, Agile meetup on February 28th. And then I'll be doing a webinar with Digite, who produces the Swift Kanban tool. And that'll be available on their live on February 15th or on their website after it's recorded.
Awesome. James?
Yeah, I got nothing. Now, February 9th, we're going to do our first local meetup of the Agile Uprising in the Philly area. So I'll be out there talking about the Agile Manifesto Signer project that we're doing. So if you haven't seen that, go out to the coalition on the Agile Uprising and check that out. So we'll be talking about, really getting back to what, the Agile Manifesto was and experiencing that with all those folks. Other than that, the next time I'll be live on stage will be most likely the Heart of Agile, Pittsburgh. So that's 427 and 428 in the Steel City of Pittsburgh. Colleen, just so you realize that it's not in Philly. And then I'll be following that up with a spot at Agile and Beyond. So excited to find out that I got in there with Colleen and a couple of the other Agile Uprisers.
Yes, congratulations to you speakers. Mr. Leff, anything you want to plug?
No, I don't have too much going on. I'm not as exciting as the other folks on the podcast as so you can always hear what's going on in Agile Uprising. We'll just keep sort of plugging away at our site, and thanks for letting me participate.
Thank you. I don't have anything exciting to plug either. I'm not as eloquent and as fun to speak as everybody else, nearly as good looking as Mr. Gifford. But I want to thank all of you listeners this evening for tuning in. Feel free to send over more suggestions for podcast topics. If you want a guest on a podcast, please let us know. We would love to have a new opinion joining us. We are always up for another guest. And once again, I want to thank all of you for your continued support in the coalition and our project. And thanks for helping us make Agile great again. Good evening.